All right, perfect. Thank you. Right, let me share my screen. All right, and there we are. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today for the first in our series of virtual programs that we're calling Book Talks. We are very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Brian Behnken, who will discuss his book, Borders of Violence and Justice. But before we get to Dr. Behnken, let me just tell you a few things about the Arizona Historical Society. And if I can move the slides, why is that not working? Sorry about this, folks. You gotta love technology sometimes. There we go. Okay. My computer just needed to catch up, I guess. All right. Well, I'm your host today, David Turpey. I oversee the publications and communications departments here at the Arizona Historical Society, and I also serve as editor of the Journal of Arizona History. Just a little information about us. The Arizona Historical Society is a nonprofit educational and cultural institution, and we're also a state agency. And we were established in 1864. We're celebrating our 160th anniversary this year. AHS collects, preserves, and tells the stories of Arizona's past through museum exhibits, libraries and collections, outreach, educational programs, and through our publications. AHS preserves our past, shares our state's stories, and connects people through the power of Arizona's history. If you like what you see today, or if you just like us in general, we hope that you'll stay connected with us. The best way to do that is to become a member of the Arizona Historical Society. There's a lot of great benefits. You'll receive 4 copies of the Journal of Arizona History in your mailbox every year. We have some really exciting issues of the journal that are coming up, so it's a great time to become a member. You also get free admission to our museums in Arizona, and you're just doing something good. You're supporting a good organization. There are other ways to stay connected. You can sign up for our email list. You can follow us on social media, and come visit us anytime at one of our museums in the state. And for more information, check out our website, azhs.org. Just a few reminders. This is a Zoom webinar. So the panelists and I cannot see or hear you. So please use the Q&A feature if you have questions or comments, and we'll leave some time at the end for Dr. Behnken to answer any questions you have. This event is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording in your email. And as I mentioned earlier, if you enjoy this program, we'd certainly appreciate it if you consider becoming a member of the Arizona Historical Society. All right, now to our speaker, Dr. Brian Behnken. And I have my notes on my computer, so I'm going to have to stop sharing my screen. All right, let me just pull those up. All right, Dr. Brian Behnken is professor in the Department of History at Iowa State University. He also has affiliate faculty appointments in the U.S. Latino Studies program and African American Studies program. His scholarship has explored relations between Latinx people and African Americans during the civil rights period, police violence, and ethno-racial forms of nationalism, among other subjects. He is the author of multiple books and articles. His most recent publication is Borders of Violence and Justice, Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and Law Enforcement in the Southwest, 1835 to 1935, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2022. And he is completing a follow-up book entitled Brown and Blue, Mexican Americans, Civil Rights, and Law Enforcement in the Southwest, 1935 to today. So we are very pleased to have Dr. Behnken with us. And I will turn over the webinar to him. Thank you.
It doesn't work when you unmute yourself and then you immediately mute yourself again. David, thank you for the warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to do this. And I'd like to also thank Janie for setting everything up. Yeah, I wrote this book. It's been almost 2 years ago now that it was published. This is the first book talk that I was invited to give. So I am incredibly thankful and grateful to the Arizona Historical Society for inviting me to do this. And I will note that my follow-up book, Brown and Blue, I just submitted right about a week ago. I just submitted the final revised version of that manuscript to UNC Press. And so if things go the way they normally do with academic presses, that book should be out right at about the next year. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, that's my beautiful book cover. UNC Press for me has always just done amazing book covers, and I really love what they did. What they did with this particular cover and the cover art. Like any good, come on, there we go. Like any good academic, I wanted to provide a brief PowerPoint just to give everyone a sense of where we'd be going in this talk. So what I did was I pulled a number of the really important examples of stuff that I found in Arizona. I just sort of pull those out to give you a sense of basically, if you just read my book from the perspective of, Arizona's territorial and state history. So it's the book, but just focusing in on Arizona itself. And I make a couple of different arguments in the book that you'll sort of see throughout this talk, because Arizona's examples fit into some of these arguments really, really well. One of the important arguments that I make is that in a lot of southwestern territories and states, and I'm talking here principally about Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, you sprinkle in a little Nevada, or a little Utah here and there, but mainly those four borderland states. That when they were formed, a lot of the folks involved in the early creation of the governments there focused in on the creation of the criminal justice system. So in a lot of these places, it's one of the first institutions that's formed. In Texas, just to give you an example, before this was during the Texas Revolution, when the state had, the republic, I should say, had just gotten formed, they actually proposed the formation of the Texas Rangers as a law enforcement body before they proposed forming an actual army to fight Mexico in the revolution. The first act of government in Los Angeles, for example, was the creation and erection of a jail. And Arizona is no different in that regard. So a lot of times, it always struck me as interesting because, I don't know, I would think like, far-flung territories and states, maybe mail service might be a good thing to focus on, or, erecting the buildings that we'll actually use to run our governments, or any other number of things that governments do. And yet what a lot of these places focused on was the creation of the CJ system. I also argue that while the CJ system in Arizona and these other places was one of the first institutions that gets formed, lynch justice or lynch law goes along with the criminal justice system sort of simultaneously. It doesn't make a lot of sense if you think like, well, we have a criminal justice system, so we don't really need to have lynching. But then one of the things that people who want to engage in lynching behavior say is, well, the justice system just isn't very, like, it's too weak or it's too lax. It doesn't do a good job, which I argue is basically a lie and an excuse or a justification to commit murder for whatever reason. One of the other things that I argue, and this is still true in some ways today, but it was especially true back in the day, that Mexican people in general, so Mexican citizens of Mexico and citizens of the United States who are of Mexican origin, they both get pigeonholed by the broader society and by the criminal justice system in certain kind of negative stereotypical ways. In particular for men, there's a perception that they're prone to murder, violence, bloodletting, that sort of thing, and sort of secondarily, any type of larceny, robbing. For women, it's always an equation. Their criminality is always equated with sex work, which I always found interesting because many of these communities across the Southwest, prostitution, sex work was not illegal, and where it was illegal, it was oftentimes tolerated. So a lot of times there's this connection to things that actually really aren't true in the broader system. Do in my chapter on criminality is try to give examples that show, in fact, that these things are not true. I do sort of make the argument that, and this is where the title of the book comes in, that the line between violence and justice in the border region is oftentimes very fine, and that's important, I think, for the whole project. And then the other thing that I talk about, and we end with Henry Garfias, because one of the things that I talk about is how Mexican origin people respond and react to the situation that they're in. They're not powerless, and they are not simply defeated people. They fight back during the Mexican-American War. They fight back after the war is over. They fight back when they're lynched, or they flee. You're going to get lynched. You're probably going to die if you can't fight back. Try to get the hell out of Dodge. That is a strategy. They're able to utilize the Mexican government in a lot of cases, and we'll see all these things again in the rest of the talk. But one of the things that I think is really important to understand, where the criminal justice system is concerned, there are, always have been, Mexican-American law officers. And one of the things that I argue is that some of these officers actually engage in police work as what they see as a civil rights strategy, as a way of trying to protect the Mexican origin community, or at least counter some of the violence that they experience. So this is your outline. I have additional slides where I sort of will remind you where we are. So in Arizona, when we're talking about the development of the criminal justice system, we really have to talk about the Howl Code. This is the first attempt at creating a criminal justice system, and it comes with the first legislative assembly of the territory, right? Again, I think that's interesting. First ever assembly, lots of stuff. What kind of government are we going to have? How are we going to get incorporated in the United States? How are we going to handle voting? How are we going to do mail? Whatever the situation might be. Yeah, that's all important, but let's make sure that we write a 400-page treatise on what our criminal justice system is really going to look like. This was actually authored by a judge named William T. Howell, so that's where you get the name there. I'm guessing some of you are probably familiar with this code, but it basically laid out all of the different, sort of criminal statutes that would be the law in Arizona. For example, it mandated that the 4 original counties establish sufficient jails and prisons, right? That's really important. It talks about the desire. It doesn't happen at this particular time, but the desire to have some kind of territorial penitentiary, which of course eventually gets developed at Yuma. It talks about the formation of sheriff's departments and the hiring of police officers and that sort of thing. It does that part in a very minor way, because that is usually the purview of either the local town or city government, or the county. So the state, or the territory, I should say, is pretty good at sort of trying to maintain those boundaries. But just a huge amount of text devoted to the criminal justice system. There are 3 chapters that are about 100 pages in total that are really interesting, because at this particular time, most states and territories did not have a penal code. In the Southwest, Texas was really the first to develop an outright penal code. And California is interesting in that they have a code that's like the Howell Code, but there within that code is a sort of penal focused section that operates like a penal code. So it's kind of interesting that within their, within their constitutional documents, within their state laws, sort of built into it is a penal code. And that's really what the Howell Code does as well in those 3 chapters, 100 pages that I mentioned. They borrow heavily from the statutes of California and basically write what becomes a penal code within this broader code. And I just think it's fascinating that with all of the things that they might need to focus on, all the problems that new governments have, that criminal justice is the thing that they're like, we have to get this, we have to get this done right away. But one of the other things that I argue is that in a lot of different ways, the Southwest is kind of like it's a frontier society, right? And a lot of times the way frontier societies work is they're always in a state of flux, and they're constantly modifying and adjusting things like their laws, right? And Arizona is a really good example of that, because from its early history, of course, its laws were the laws of New Mexico. Once it gets pulled out, or once Arizona gets formed as a state, then suddenly they're like, oh, we have to do our own laws, right? We have to adjust this stuff. And so you literally have this transformation where you have a law, you have a criminal justice system, you have laws on the ground, but then we're going to totally redo them once we become a territory. So again, I think it's really interesting that you can see that sort of status, if you will, of kind of constantly changing and being in flux. So we do have a fairly sophisticated criminal justice system that gets formed. We do have fairly effective law enforcement bodies that get formed at this particular time. And we're going to see in a little while just how fastidious law enforcement is at trying to track down, try and punish people who break the law. And yet at the same time, there is this sort of extralegal lynch justice that happens as well. And one of the things that I found that was really interesting in the region, but in Arizona especially, is just the number of times that white people especially would basically argue that, the law was non-existent or the law was weak. I'll give you a good quote in just a second that demonstrates that. And so we have to do it ourselves. We have to take this idea of criminal justice on ourselves and punish these bad people. And the thing that I argue is, like I said before, like A, that's a lie. B, a lot of times when these folks are making that assertion, they've broken people out of jail to lynch them, which suggests the system's working, right? Those people are where they were supposed to be, at least until they get tried. In other cases, there's actually police officers, sheriffs, constables, whatnot, that are participants in a lynching. And it's like, well, but they were there, right? So they existed, clearly. They were doing something. So how they could be seen as like non-existent or lax just doesn't make a lot of sense until you, of course, understand that that's just a justification. And one of the ways this happens is through the formation, or one of the ways lynching happens, I should say, is through the formation of what are generally referred to as vigilance committees. Arizona is really par none as far as the diversity of the creation of different vigilance committees. And I have a couple of different quotes that sort of bear that out. So, for example, Vigilance Committee in 1871 was formed to, quote, combat lawlessness and, quote, the alarming frequency of deeds of violence in our community. They called vigilance committees the self-constituted arbiters of justice, and said society had been outraged by lawless and desperate men. 1877, there had been a string of stagecoach robberies. Another vigilance committee gets founded, this one arguing that they should I'm going to try to get the quotation correct, that for robbers should be strung up to limbs or shot down like sheep killing dogs. There's an editorial in a Phoenix newspaper in 1881. Newspapers were really good at basically counseling in favor of lynch justice. This one said, "We never counsel violence or hasty action. Well, we never would counsel that, but a little wholesale hanging of bad characters would help alleviate problems." 1881 again, in the Arizona, New Mexico border area, they talked about a rash of horse stealing and said hanging is the antidote employed. So again, vigilance committees basically making these arguments that they have to do it on their own, and they're basically, as the one said, these self-constituted arbiters of justice. This is one of the, and I know it's a little blurry. This is one of the cases that I write about. Hang on, I realize now my Zoom thing is blocking my view. In this particular case, it was an individual who was described as a half-breed of Mexican nativity, who basically got killed by a group of men. And in this particular, and this is the Weekly Journal Minor, but the Silver Belt did a very good job of this as well. They say, we regret to have to chronicle a case, the proceedings of which are so closely allied to lynch law, yet it would be wrong to censure those men for the act. The law in Arizona is too imbecile, too weak, too cowardly to punish dangerous characters, which facts suggest to men of propriety of defending themselves. That's a really good example of what I'm talking about, right? The law's too weak, too cowardly, so we have to do things. Ourselves. I have a lot of different really good examples of what lynch law looks like and how in the Southwest it really kind of complicates our understanding of what extralegal lynching is. And this Tucson example is a really, really good one. A, because of what happens, and B, because both white people and Mexican origin people participate. And we do know it's somewhat of an untold story, but we do know that, for example, African Americans and Mexican Americans oftentimes utilize lynching, not to the same degree and not for the same reasons, but utilize lynching much like white people. So this is a case that happened in August of 1873 when three men, and they are Leocardo Cordova, Clemente Lopez, and Jesus Saharipa, allegedly had murdered Vicente Hernandez and his wife Librada Chavez. Now, this was a really gruesome robbery that had basically gone bad, and you can see from some of the text there that basically they beat this couple with like clubs with an axe handle, and stabbed them in what the paper described as an incredibly bloody scene. Both Hernandez and Chavez were very, very well liked members of the Tucson community. They were known, and it was only discovered after the fact that she was pregnant. And that seems to have been the thing that sort of put people over the edge. They basically said, so all these three men had been arrested, right? They had been found out and they had been arrested. And the townspeople quite literally said, look, we're going to go have a service for Hernandez and Chavez, and then when we're done, we're going to come back and we're going to hang these men. And pretty much that's what happened. Immediately after the funeral, they go, and what the Arizona Weekly Citizen said was that very soon thereafter, the four men, there was an additional white dude that was in there too, John Willis, so four altogether. The four men above named were brought out of the jail with small bandages over their eyes, put in wagons, ropes adjusted to their necks, and the wagons drawn out, and all four hung side by side. So again, I think this case is interesting. One of the people involved in sort of tracking down the killers was a Tucson constable named Frank Esperanza. I mentioned before Mexican American service and law enforcement. Esperanza is a good example of that. He helped track down the killers. He's also a good example of how we have names that just sort of pop into the record and then we never hear about them again. So very little that we know about Esperanza. One of the other things, though, is because the town sort of did this, together, right? The Pima County coroner at the time, his name was Solomon Warner, he conducted an inquest into these killings. And so in this particular case, it would be an in absentia inquest because they were not there because they were dead, right? But into the four men that had killed, that the town had killed. And the inquest jury came out with really interesting finding. They said, we find that the said hanging was committed by the people of Tucson en masse. And we do further say that in view of the terrible and bloody murders that have been committed by the three Mexicans above named, and the tardiness with which justice was being met out to John Willis, the fourth man that I mentioned before, John Willis, who was a murderer, that the extreme measures taken by our fellow citizens this morning in vindication of their lives, their property, and the peace and good order of society, while it is to be regretted and deplored that such extreme measures were necessary, seems to the jury to have been the inevitable results of allowing criminals to escape the penalties of their crimes. So in essence, what happens is, so these folks get arrested, they get taken out of the jail, they get executed by the townspeople, and then afterwards, the inquest jury basically excuses them of their actions, basically saying that they were enraged and the law didn't do anything about it, and so we had to do it ourselves. And of course, the fact that they were arrested and awaiting trial would seem to negate that the law didn't work, and yet we have that argument being made. One of the other things that I thought was interesting about this case is that they did sort of have like a trial. And in that particular trial, a man by the name of William, hang on, where's his name? I think it's William. Zeckendorf is his last name. Basically asked the crowd, like as they're gathering around, asked them what the punishment should be. And the response from the crowd was, que mueran. Or basically let them die. I find that to be really, really interesting because you ask a crowd a question and they respond in Spanish. I'm not sure if Zeckendorf himself asked that question in Spanish, but the fact that the response came in Spanish, again, shows you that there was at least some participation from the Mexican origin community at the time, which in Tucson was not insignificant. It was about 50% of the population. So again, this is a really good case that sort of encapsulates a lot of the different stuff that I try to write about. So too is the case of Manuel Mejia. His example, so this means Arizona, his example starts my book off. It's the first example that I use in the introduction. So the book basically starts with Arizona. I might add there are other chapters that begin with examples from Arizona as well. So there's quite a bit on Arizona in the book. But Manuel Mejia is really an interesting case because I call him the man that was lynched 4 times. And I'll explain what that means in just a little while. But he got sort of involved in a really kind of charged case at the time. This is the case of a man named Barney Martin and his family. They had been store owners. This was in Maricopa County. Excuse me, this was in Yavapai County. They had been store owners, had decided to sell out for about $4,000. And when they were leaving the state, they were actually ambushed, murdered, and that money was stolen. When that murder came out, a number of different law enforcement officials from around the state really descended on this area, because it was such an outrageous case, right? And what ended up happening was they brought Manuel Mejia in because he had been in that part of the territory for about 15 years. He did mining work, he did agriculture, he did a lot of different stuff, and was pretty well known and pretty well liked. And since he knew the territory well and he had access to horses, he was basically put in charge of trying to help the law enforcement bodies figure out what had happened. And so that's what he was actually, supposed to be doing. Instead, a deputy sheriff from Maricopa County, his name was J.W. Blankenship, actually takes Mejia into custody for the murders. I should mention that these murders happened sort of right on the border area between Yavapai County and Maricopa, and so that's why you have law enforcement bodies from both sheriff's departments involved in this. Mejia spent 17 days in jail because of this basically erroneous arrest. And when he's released, a group of about 10 men led by Charles Ganung and Thomas Bryan basically attack Mejia. They beat him. They tie him to a horse. They drag him through the streets of Phoenix, behind this horse, and then they try to lynch him. And what they do is they string him up and let him hang for a while. And then once he's hung for a while, they let him back down and demand that he, basically confess to the murder. And on the left-hand side there, that's actually Mejia's testimony, because he does live through the event. And you can see there sort of in the middle where he says, that these men strung me up, they let me down, and one of them, whom I recognized as Charles B. Ganung, asked me the question, where's the $4,000 money which Barney Martin had? And I answered him that I knew nothing about it. And so because they don't like that answer, they beat him some more, they kick him some more, and then they hang him again. And they ultimately do that 4 different times. On the 4th time, they basically decided they would leave him for dead. And they went off, the lynchers went off to a nearby saloon to have a drink. And it just so happened that Mejia was somehow able to get the rope in his mouth and then retrieve a pocket knife from his boot. And so he was able to save his own life by not strangling, by having the rope in his mouth. And then he was able to cut himself down. He falls badly on a barbed wire fence, really slices his arm up good, basically has to book it across a little river. The lynchers hear all this commotion and run out, and they start shooting him as he flees. And he is able to get away, and he goes to the home of a local Mexican family, and he asks for aids. And this is what I make the argument that sort of community networks oftentimes do provide safety and security to folks who have been treated wrong, and this is a good example of that. That family calls in Marshal Henry Garfias to try to help Manuel Mejia out. Garfias actually comes to his aid. He takes him back to the jail, but he does that for his own protection, while Mejia can basically swear out warrants against these men that were, the ones that were responsible for lynching him. He does that in particular against Ginung and Thomas Bryan. They basically do go on trial, and basically their trial is dismissed because of what they call a lack of evidence. It was basically a he said kind of story. This is a really big deal, right? It's a really big deal. You basically have an innocent person, and that's of course what happens a lot of times in lynchings, right? But you have an innocent person who was a well-liked individual, who's treated really, really, really badly. A lot of the other officials in the law enforcement community, they don't understand why this deputy sheriff Blankenship takes Mejia into custody. They don't understand why he spent 17 days in jail. A lot of them report like this guy had nothing to do with it. We don't really know what's going on here. Because of that, and because of how Mejia gets treated, the Mexican government gets involved in this as well. And this is an envoy at the time. His name was Matias Romero. He sends a number of letters to the Secretary of State, to the territorial government, to local government, basically asking them to intervene. And they don't really do that, right? The government does try some minor things, right? But once the guys get off, there's really not a whole lot more for the government to do. And so eventually what happens is that this envoy, Matias Romero, he actually files an official complaint or claim. This would be a reclamación in Spanish, to the U.S. Secretary of State, T.F. Bayard, um, demanding that the government do something about this case. And this is really important because it's that declaration where he says reclamation, that designation changes the case from just a regular old case that the Mexican government's interested in, to an actual international incident. And at the very bottom of that, you can see legation of Mexico, Washington, D.C. If you go down to the fourth line from the bottom, you can see the words, "We're guilty of these outrages," and to present a reclamation based upon this evidence. So that's really, really like a huge deal. It doesn't really change anything. It's unfortunate that the Mexican government a lot of times tries to get involved in these cases, but doesn't oftentimes have a whole lot of power to change things. But I still think it's important nonetheless to acknowledge that, and to show when you have a case like this where you have a government response. I should add that it was only like a handful of years later that the state pretty much figured out that they think the people that killed Barney Martin and his family were actually associated with the Vega gang, and with a guy that's somewhat well known in Arizona named Charles Stanton, and that in fact Stanton had bought the Martin store, knew they had the $4,000 on them because he had given it to him, and then basically charged the Vega gang with killing the family and robbing them to get his $4,000 back. We still don't 100% know for sure if that's what happened, but that's what seems to have happened. And I should add, I mentioned Manuel Mejia lived, but he was permanently injured from this encounter. Okay, so criminality, I mentioned already. Lots of stereotypes out there, but also criminality tells us something about law enforcement itself. And as I mentioned, law enforcement is not non-existent, right? It's not weak and cowardly and lax. And this is actually the example that opens my third chapter, and that's a case of a guy by the name of Valerio Garcia. I thought it was interesting when I was reading this case and they talk about what they're charging him for, and I was literally like, did they say 500 sheep? Like, surely that's a typo. And then you go to another page and it talks about these 500 sheep. I'm like, wow, that's a lot of sheep. But he stole these sheep from this guy, James Houck. The territory basically spent like close to a decade trying to track him down. And one of the things that I love about how states keep records is we have all of these examples of what you see in front of you, of them basically trying to track down, authorize arrest warrants, whatever, to send the sheriff out to try to find him. And in one of these cases, they spent, you can see the dollar amount there at the bottom of that list on the left there. It was $175.60, which is well over $6,000 today, which I think is just like, that's a really good example of how, in fact, law enforcement is trying pretty hard. Now, they don't actually ever collar Valerio Garcia. I think he escaped to Mexico, and that was the end of that. But again, it shows you what I'm talking about, right? I think the testimony, the situation with Martin Duran and Reyes Baca is another really good example of how the state works, but also how sometimes like Arizona is just weird, like weird stuff happens there. So this is a particular case in 1887 that aroused a lot of attention in the region and in the territory, especially. Reyes Baca and Martin Duran, they had a romantic relationship. It soured at some point. She left him and began residing with her friend Martina Gonzalez. On the night of September 18th, Martin Duran had basically gone to this town where they lived, and gone to a local saloon. I should be more clear, this is in Flagstaff. Had gone to a saloon, gotten drunk, and then convinced a group of musicians at the saloon to return with him to Martina Gonzalez's house so that they could try to serenade Reyes Baca with the hopes that she would return to Martin Duran. They do this, she comes out, they talk, they go inside, they talk some more. And then at some point she's sitting on the bed, she turns to light a cigarette, and he pulls out a gun and shoots her 4 times, and she dies right there on the bed. He was very quickly arrested, and then put on trial. And it's really the trial, I think, that shows you how interesting and maybe kind of strange this situation is. They tried him in Prescott. The defense basically tries 2 strategies to save Martin Duran from the noose. The first is sorry, I see a bunch of things in the chat. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, thank you. Got it. So they try a couple of strategies to get him off. The first is to malign Reyes Baca as a sex worker, right? So they basically say she was involved in sex work. She was promiscuous. Martina Gonzalez's house was actually a house of ill fame, as they would have said back in the day, and that aroused Martin Duran's passion, and caused him to act in a crazy manner. That may sound really horrible to some of us today. It was actually a pretty common strategy back in the day, because if they could prove that his passions had been aroused in this way, it could very well have been the thing that excused him for his actions. The other thing, though, was to claim that he was just so drunk that he was out of his mind. And that works as like a kind of like a capacity defense to basically say he was not in his right mind. He didn't have the capacity to know right from wrong. And so in the trial testimony, you can see a lot of these things, was Gonzalez's house a house of ill fame? Is it a house of ill fame? They ask in multiple different times in the trial. One time asking someone, was Duran so much under the influence of liquor as to be unconscious, right? Is he so drunk to know or have the capacity to know right or wrong? And just about everybody said, no, he knew what was going on. I think it's interesting. Duran decides to testify on his own behalf. And when asked, what made you shoot the girl, which is in the cross-examination right above us, his answer was, she forced me to kill her. How did she force you? By treating me so bad when I didn't give her any occasion for it. Is that the only reason you had for shooting her? Yes, sir. So you have right here someone who's literally just all of that stuff that they said about Reyes Baca potentially being a sex worker, involved in sex work, or him being out of his mind, right out the window with Martin Duran's territory, and with his testimony, I should say. And he is ultimately convicted and sentenced to death. But again, I said it was a weird case. So next slide. So what happens? Well, a number of people from both Prescott and Flagstaff inundate the governor at the time, C. Meyer Zulick, with a number of requests that he commute Duran's sentence. And this one is signed by 14 residents who said that because of his youth and the act was committed while in a fit of passion and jealousy and under the influence of liquor, that it amounted to, in their opinion, temporary insanity. I also have a letter from an attorney who basically took sort of all the different legal stuff and tried to explain how the sentence didn't fit. And I write in the book, like, this guy must not have been much of an attorney, because, it's pretty clear that this is pretty much a case of cold-blooded murder. And in fact, what it was supposed to be a case of murder-suicide. What Duran says, I killed her, and then, the authorities got me, but they didn't really need to get me because I was planning to kill myself anyway. So, it was much more of a murder-suicide. He is ultimately executed. I love that the Arizona Silver Belt, as I say here, waxed poetic in its description of his execution. Hempen cordage in Prescott, March 2nd, noosed in a coiling fold the felon neck of Martin Duran, who murdered his mistress in Flagstaff, and when cut down, he was food for worms. Relating to criminality, and I know I've been talking for a little while. I do want to leave time for questions and whatnot. I did want to mention the territorial prison, and just one of the things that's great about doing research in Arizona is the records have been so well kept. And one of the cases that I also write about that I think is another good example of how the justice system operates is involving a woman by the name of Manuela Fimbres. I found her in a variety of different locations as far as archives are concerned, and newspapers and letters and that sort of thing. And then when I was doing research in the territorial prison, I just happened to be thumbing through these. I took a lot of pictures of these different sheets, as you see here, and I don't even know how I saw it, but I happened to see her name. It was like, oh snap, that's right, she was there. So you see her 572, and I've sort of blown that up. She was interesting because sorry, I'll come back on that one. She helped her boyfriend murder an individual, and she went to jail for that. But about 8 months after she was in jail, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. And then the state started saying, like, huh, maybe this isn't a place for a woman with a child. And in fact, the territorial prison at this particular time did not have a woman's prison. It had like a segregated quarter that they had created, but it didn't have an actual women's prison. So there was a lot of concern about her being there. In fact, she would have served her time with another woman, and they oftentimes would have been housed together. The state eventually decides to release her. And this is an example of what we call compassionate release. She had a child. She had also battled a really bad sickness. And the state was basically like, look, we don't have a women's prison. This is no place for a woman, as one of the state officers said. And, maybe we need to just let her go. And she was eventually pardoned, and her sentence was commuted. And I think that's interesting. Now, you could say, they didn't, it was because they didn't want to care for a sick woman and her baby. That could certainly be true. She was deported. The federal government deported her right after she was released. So that might indicate that the state didn't care about her all that much. But compassionate releases in this particular time are somewhat rare, and they happen for all different ethnic communities. And I mentioned that women sometimes served their sentences together. I cropped this picture right out of my book so that you could see, like, hey, here we have a good example of three women who are doing their time together. But also down at the bottom, if you'll notice the credit line there, because I found this with y'all, so it was really great. Okay, territorial prison had great records. That's a lot of fun. Here you see they have information about what people did, their occupation, names and races of the prisoners, their nativity, just a ton of information in these records that I think a lot of times people don't really realize is so, these sources are so rich. And I am trying to get through this quickly, but I did want to mention law enforcement officers, right? Because Mexican origin people do serve in law enforcement, and they do in part serve to try to counter some of the negative perceptions or the violence and racism that Mexican origin people experience. And of course, Henry Garfias is one of the earliest and one of the most important. He is what we would call an effective law officer. In other words, he did a really good job. He had a lengthy career. I'm just going to mention this one case because I know we're running a little short on time. But this is an example where he was a deputy sheriff at the time. This is the other thing about Garfias, if you're aware. He basically gets elected or appointed to any number of different positions in the criminal justice system, including to the position of deputy sheriff. And this is a case where he tracked down, for over a year, tracked this guy, Antonio Quarento, who would attack people with an axe in Phoenix in 1894. Garfias was responsible for bringing two people who attacked folks with odd weapons. One dude became known as the Saber Slasher because he attacked people with a sword. This guy with an axe. Garfias spent a year, like I said, tracking him, traveling over 200 miles to finally bring him to justice, which I think shows, again, that dedication to good law and order, and just that he was an effective law officer. And of course, sadly, he did die that following year in 1896, and his death was a real marked occasion in the territory. So those are kind of my examples. I leave you with this last picture just because I think it's badass. And I think it's a really good example of how basically bandits can get portrayed. And again, it comes from Arizona. So I'm leaving that there. And yeah, I'm going to stop and see what maybe kind of questions we have. And let's go. And David, how do we handle this?
Yeah, I'm happy to read the questions to you
Okay.
if you want me to sort of
I think,
to do that.
yeah, I think that
And
would be great because you can sort of maybe even like group some together or paraphrase them better than I can.
sure, yeah. So it looks like we have 4 or 5 questions so far, and please can those of you in the audience, please feel free to add any other additional questions you have, and we should be able to get to them. All right, so the first question is someone in the audience said, I'd be curious to know the demographics your book reflects and researched at this time, and how you view the most positive solution or path for current immigration and the border states now.
Okay, well, that's a big question.
Yeah,
So in the period that this book is taking place in, that period from basically 1835 to 1935, we don't know. We don't have good records on the demographics of the population at this particular time. And the main reason why that's the case is both the state government, territorial government, and the federal government counted Mexican origin people as white. So they get sort of lumped into that category. And we really sort of just have to take our best guess. So I mentioned Tucson at that particular time. The best guess is about 50% of the population is of Mexican ancestry. And you can sort of do your own math, I guess, there of trying to figure out like, okay, well, that how many indigenous people does that include? Are there any African Americans or Asian people included that in those tallies? But I don't have a good answer for you because we actually don't have that kind of data in this specific way. Now, as far as immigration is concerned, I mean, that's a contemporary issue. And I'm a historian, so I'm good at talking about the past and less good about talking about the future and policy and that sort of thing. Um, but I'll be the first to say, I think like a lot of us, I think our immigration system is broken. I'm really tired of the political football that has become over the past several decades, and it's almost like clockwork that you can see when there's especially a presidential election cycle, how the immigration and sort of the anti-immigrant rhetoric will pop up, and then very little said about it after the fact. Most of the history that I write about in this book, and then a good portion of the next book, principally from when the United States took Mexico's Northwest Territory away from them, really up until about the 1950s, the border was open. And I'm sort of a fan of trying to find ways to relax border security so that we can have more of a system like we had back, and this would have been still in the 80s, where people had the ability to live in Mexico, travel to the United States and work and go back home at night. And vice versa. There were a lot of Americans that chose to live in Mexico at that time because it was more affordable for them. I don't know how you get that done with the fears that people have about border violence and gangs and whatnot. But, I would certainly like to see a softening of the rhetoric, if that answers your question.
I think, yeah, that's a perfect answer. Yeah, thank you for that. All right, well, we have 2 questions here, which I think are really good and they tie together. So I'll combine them into one question. How do lynchings of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Arizona differ from other states or regions like Texas, for example? And how do they differ, or are they similar to violence perpetrated against indigenous people?
That's a great question. I have a section in the book where I do talk about that. So in most, I'll put it to you like this, especially in New Mexico, Arizona, and California, the vast majority of Mexican origin people who are lynched, who are illegally executed, whether they're hung, whether they're shot, whatever the situation might be, almost all of those examples are about people who are thought to have broken the law in some ways, in some way. And so the lynching becomes the post trial execution part of the criminal justice system. So even though the justice system is working and those things probably would have happened, individuals on the ground decide to take the law in their own hand. I have a case in California that I talk about where they literally break the people out of jail, take them down to the courthouse, hold a trial, and then take them outside and execute them. It's not a legitimate trial. It's not a legitimate execution, but you have all of those same kind of proceedings taking place. So it's almost always for some, some legal, perceived legal violation, whether you thought somebody stole something, they stole a horse or a saddle or a watch or whatever it might be. In some cases, it's more like they shot at me, like somebody shot at me, and so I was angry that they shot at me, and so then I got a bunch of people together and we went and killed that person. Like that happens. But it's almost always that sort of thing. The way in which I think we understand lynching, especially for African Americans, is always either the excuse or the justification is always some violation of sexual norms or taboos at the particular time. We know from a lot of cases that again is an excuse that's used to justify killing somebody who maybe had a successful business or had attempted to vote or whatever that kind of situation was. For Mexican origin people, I found, and again, this is why I singled out New Mexico, Arizona, and California. I found a couple of cases in Texas where that's what happened, or we think that's what happened. Some type of violation of sexual or gender norms, and then the person who is lynched is actually lynched in the what we call the carnivalesque fashion. That's what a lot of African Americans experience, where it's a huge gathering of people. It involves the gouging and the removal of body parts. It involves hanging, burning, shooting, all of that sort of thing. And then I want to be really honest with you, for the lynching of indigenous people, I don't really know that I have a good answer on that one. I'm not as well read in that particular area. I would say that in some cases, it probably is similar to what Mexican origin people experienced, in that there's a sense that somebody cheated or robbed something or whatever the case may be. But I don't have specific information that I can draw from to feel like I can effectively answer that part of the question.
All right. Well, we are at 1 o'clock. Let me maybe give you one more question because we have a few here. Let me pick one of these and then we'll end with that question. Did you notice any regional differences within Arizona, particularly sort of Phoenix versus Tucson?
Yeah. So you could just say that, right? Phoenix and Tucson, differences there. It could be me. I'm not in Arizona. I'm not from Arizona. I'm from Texas. I really like Arizona. I spent a good deal of time there, but I'm trying to figure out how to say what I think in the right way that won't bug people. I'm just going to say it, and if it bugs you, I don't mean anything. I've always had a sense in Arizona that people in Phoenix, and maybe Tempe as well, sort of see themselves in a light in which they don't view, Tucsonans, for example. They see themselves as better. And I think some of that existed at the time. We're the bigger city. We have there was a lot of we have better law enforcement. Like we just do things better here. So maybe there's that. And if I'm wrong about that, I totally apologize. But I would put the regional difference differently. And the way that I would say it is there's a fairly big difference between what happens in the far southern part of the territory in the state and what happens in more of like the northern regions. The violence that happens in the actual borderlands, I mean, it's pretty extreme. And this is the case for both New Mexico and Arizona. Both we see large numbers of these Texas cowboys coming in and perpetrating violence. There's a lot of back and forth border violence, rustling and killing and that sort of thing. And that's one of the reasons why in the border region itself, there's so many calls for lynching, because I think the violence seems so out of step with what anybody might have like ever wanted. But again, law enforcement is there. They're trying to do their job. So that argument that like we don't have law enforcement, we have to do it ourselves, never works. And then like for Northern Arizona, a lot of times it's more like I sort of see more like in the mining camps where you have like there's maybe economic competition going on, and perhaps for some of those, especially for those white people there, let's say less familiarity with the Mexican origin population that people in other parts of the territory would have had, and so they see them in really negative ways because they don't actually have experience with them, and they don't know how wrong they are, if that makes any sense. I don't know. That's how I'd put the regional thing.
Yeah, thank you. That's really fascinating. Yeah, so we're past 1 o'clock now, so I want to respect everyone's time. So I think we'll wrap it up here. And let me just say thank you again so much to our presenter, Dr. Brian Behnken, for being with us here today. This was really fantastic, and I hope you'll come back and do this again when your second book comes out.
I love
So
to, yeah.
yeah, fantastic. All right. Well, and again, everyone, this has been recorded, and you'll receive a link to this recording in your email. And thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody. Thanks for everything.
Yeah, thank you again. Take care.
Bye.